The Pathans by Olaf Caroe. Chapter 3. The Passing of Alexander. The Achaemenian Empire of Persia fell to Alexander the Great in 331 BC when, at Gaugamela near Arbela, the modern Erbil in the vicinity of Mosul, the armies of the last Achaemenid, Darius Kodomanus, were overthrown by the conqueror. The battle was a stiff one, and the Persian nobility fought with great courage. Darius fled to Ecbatana, Hamadan, and, although resistance was maintained far into the night by Saka and Bactrian formations from eastern Iran, and it took Alexander several years more to pacify the empire. This was the decisive battle, and the war was over. Sir David Hogarth implies that Arrian's list of the Persian array at Gaugamela includes Pathans and hillmen from all the range of the Hindu Kush. But unfortunately, this is a statement to be set in the realm of constructive imagination, for a reference to the source in Arrian, Anabasis 3:8, establishes only that the satrap of Arachosia had under him, among others, the Indian Highlanders so-called. We may conjecture that these included Gandharioi, Paktuis, Aparutai, and others mentioned by Herodotus, but that is all. It was not until the spring of 327 BC that Alexander was ready to lead his armies down into the Indus Valley. The intervening 4 years were spent in those astonishing marches which took him first to Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, then across Persia in pursuit of Darius to the neighbourhood of modern Meshed, and thence by the route across what is now Afghanistan via Farah, Kandahar, and Kabul, though none of these places, except possibly the last, had then been founded, to cross the Hindu Kush into Bactria, the modern Afghan Turkestan, and reach as far as the Jaxartes, the Sirdaria, beyond Samarkand. These marchings are represented by the old historians as having been undertaken first in pursuit of the fugitive Darius, and then to track down Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, who had murdered the last representative of the great kings at Damghan, and attempted to set himself up as de facto ruler of the eastern satrapies of the empire. But in reality, Alexander was engaged in consolidating his rule to the furthest eastern limits of the Persian Empire, and founding cities according to his set policy to that end. This policy, while it succeeded in bequeathing to Alexander's successors in Asia, the Seleucid Diadochi, an empire over Syria and Babylonia which lasted 150 years, did not endure more than a few decades on the Persian plateau, while in Gandhara and India, Alexander's invasion had no immediate administrative consequences whatever. His officers were driven out of the country on the Indus by the Mauryas after a few years, and when that Indian power established its rule in and around Gandhara, such memories as there remained of Persia were not of Alexander, but of the long period of Iranian rule under the Achaemenids. The Maurya Empire of India itself, which finally drove Seleucus out of the northwest frontier region in 305 BC, was in no way the result of, or the reaction to, Alexander's splendid but transitory raid. Its monarchs, Chandragupta and Asoka, did not need Alexander's example to teach them what empire meant. They had had before them for 2 centuries the stately fabric of the Persian monarchy, and it was that empire which impressed their imagination and served as a model for their institutions. In his impact on Gandhara, it is as a raider on the grand scale, and only indirectly as a spreader of Greek thought and culture, that Alexander must be seen. The later Greco-Bactrian kingdom, under which Hellenic influences did reach the Indus, was not his foundation, and its power did not extend to Gandhara until 150 years after his death. The total duration of Alexander's own stay on the frontier from the time he left Bactria in the early summer of 327 BC to his crossing of the Indus early in the following year was less than 12 months, during the whole of which time he was engaged either in reducing fortresses or fighting his way forward. When he crossed the great river, he passed out of our picture. he was to go on as far as the Beas and then sail down the rivers to the sea. His was a one-way passage through Gandhara. It is often said now upon the frontier that such and such a tribe, or even family, claims Grecian or Macedonian blood inherited from Alexander or his soldiers. The Afridis, for instance, have their tradition of an admixture of Greek blood. They point to their Grecian features, and indeed, many a young Afridi might stand as a model for Apollo, while the Afridi elder can display the gravity of Zeus. There are young Pathan warriors, not only among the Afridis, whose strong classical profile and eagle eye recall the features of Alexander himself. It is said that Alexander's army, in its passage through this country, left behind deserters who mingled their blood with that of the people of Tira and the Khyber. But the fact is that there is no local written record, Indian or Achaemenian, inscriptional or other, of Alexander's passage through the country. Indeed, there is no contemporary or even near-contemporary Asian reference to his Indian expedition at all. Were it not for Arrian and the other classical sources, Greek and Latin, the very memory of Alexander's connection with Gandhara would have faded like a dream. These Afridi and other traditions almost certainly have their origin in the body of Western classical learning translated into Arabic in the days of the Abbasids of Baghdad, and are part of the Unani or Greek law which so largely influenced Islamic literae humaniores. It was thus that the great deeds of Sikandar Zulqarnain, Alexander of the Two Horns, became a part of the folklore of the Muslim world. Until the corpus of Greek and Latin learning became available in such ways, the very existence of Alexander and his army had been long forgotten in those parts of eastern Iran and India through which he passed, and so short was the time he spent upon the frontier that little could have been left behind. Hellenic influence was to return later to these parts and to persist for some time under the Greco-Bactrian kings. That period, laboriously reconstructed mainly from numismatic evidence, also left the faintest of memories in the lands where Greco-Bactrians ruled, and no world-shaking names like that of Alexander. It seems likely that traditions which could more reasonably be connected with this subsequent Hellenism have invoked the great name of Alexander as soon as the Arab learning of Baghdad had given access to Greek history. But in truth, in this region, the Macedonian was a bird of passage, and himself made no permanent impact on events on the eastern frontier of what had been the Persian Empire. Arrian, our main authority, was a contemporary of the Roman emperors Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, and served as consul under the second. He probably lived to circa AD 175, and was thus writing 500 years after the events he is recording, very unlike Herodotus, who wrote only a generation after the culmination of his drama. Arrian's Anabasis, Expedition, is in Greek. Other authorities of much less value are Quintus Curtius Rufus, in good Latin but rhetorical, and Plutarch, who wrote a series of comparative lives in Greek, both belonging to the 1st century of the Christian era. There are also a few geographical references in the works of Strabo, 64 BC to AD 19, and of the Alexandrine astronomer Ptolemy, 2nd century AD. Arrian is generally admitted to be a first-class military historian. There is no doubt that his work is based on contemporary records, now lost, including the diaries of Ptolemy I, Alexander's companion and founder of the Egyptian dynasty, and of Megasthenes, whom Seleucus, Alexander's general and successor in the east, sent as ambassador to the Mauryan court. His Anabasis abounds in material relating to the crossing of mountains and rivers, the details of sieges and engagements, the bravery of Alexander and his captains, and, indeed, of those against whom they fought. His accounts of the sieges and storm of such places as Basira and Aornos are fine examples of military writing, full of vivid strokes and careful descriptions of local topography, enabling archaeologists to recapture the events described on the ground today. But, as might be expected from the accounts of a military expedition resulting in no permanent conquest or government, his work is in other respects disappointing. It has little bearing on the composition, origins, or languages of the peoples of the frontier regions through which Alexander was passing. In this, it is in strong contrast with Herodotus, and the reason is not far to seek. Herodotus was drawing on material accumulated during the best part of 100 years of Persian Achaemenian rule. The great fabric of that empire had sifted the ore and refined the gold in its administrative system. It still remained in vast strength when Herodotus wrote, even though Xerxes, the successor of Darius the Great, had failed to conquer Greece, and as noted, Herodotus wrote when memories were fresh. Arrian and Alexander's other chroniclers, on the other hand, not only wrote many centuries after the event, distance might indeed have given them perspective, but were describing a series of actions which took place during the anarchy which succeeded the Achaemenian collapse, and, in Gandhara and India at least, were not destined to have a lasting effect. Moreover, Herodotus, as Rawlinson points out, contrived to bring the whole known world into his story, glancing at the beginnings of states and empires, and exhibiting before our eyes a panoramic view of history. Arrian, balanced and vivid though he is, merely wrote up the campaign of the world's greatest soldier. The researches of Herodotus into matters relating to the eastern confines of the Persian Empire reflect something like the files and records of the Achaemenian imperial machine, those of Arrian, the intelligence diaries of a campaign undertaken in a period of downfall of empire and consequent revolution. The additions made by Strabo and Ptolemy are mainly geographical in scope and add little to the story. Yet, since the world's greatest captain before Chinggis Khan traversed the northwest frontier, we are bound to follow him on his passage through it. It is even possible that the conqueror's roots, and the place and tribal names mentioned, may afford some insight into our study of origins. It will be easiest to start with a short summary of Arrian's account, quoting the actual words in translation, where these seem relevant. When the spring of 327 BC was past, Alexander led his army from Bactria across the Hindu Kush to the Alexandria he had founded 2 years earlier in the land of the Pathans. This Alexandria is now identified with Jabal Suraj, 15 miles from Kapisa or Bagram in the Kuidaman north of Kabul. Ptolemy tells us the Pathans, called by him Pathans, consisted of 5 tribes, including the Parsyata, whom, as we have seen, Morgenstern is inclined to connect with the Pashtuns. I have given reasons why a connection with Farsiwans or Tajiks seems to me more probable. Thence Alexander proceeded to the river Kofan, called by Ptolemy the Coa, and to a place named Nicaea, the Victorious. The Kofan is clearly the Kabul River above its passage through the Khyber Hills, and Nicaea, though unidentifiable, must be somewhere either in Lagman or in the plain now known as that of Jalalabad or Ningrahar. Arrian then proceeds. Having reached Nicaea and sacrificed to the goddess Athena, he dispatched a herald to Taxils and to the chiefs on this side of the river Indus, directing them to meet him where it was most convenient for each. He then divided his army and dispatched Hephaestion and Perdiccas with the brigades of Gorgias, Clytus, and Meleager, half the companion cavalry, and the whole of the mercenary cavalry, to the land of Pusilaotis and the river Indus. He ordered them either to seize by force whatever places lay on their route, or to accept their submission if they capitulated, and when they came to the Indus to make whatever preparations were necessary for the transport of the army across that river. They were accompanied on their march by Taxils and the other chiefs, and on reaching the Indus they began to carry out the instructions they had received. One of the chiefs, however, Astes, satrap of the land of Pusilaotis, revolted but perished in the attempt. In this account, Taxils, of course, is the ruler of Taxila, 35 miles east of and beyond the Indus, famous as the seat of later Greco-Bactrian, Saka and Kushan civilizations, and the site of archaeological research. Pusilautis is universally accepted as identical with the Prakrit form Pukalauti of the Sanskrit Pushkalavati, fixed since the time of General Cunningham as the immense mound in the neighbourhood of Chausadar and Prang, 18 miles northeast of Peshawar. The land of Pusilautis is therefore the Peshawar Plain, or Gandhara. We hear nothing from Arrian of any Paskapuros or similar name, and we may conclude therefore that in the 200 years that passed between the time of Silax and that of Alexander, Chausadar had superseded Peshawar as the capital of Gandhara. There has been no systematic excavation on the Chausadar site, but numerous casual finds of Indo-Greek coins and fascinating sculpture reliefs of Roman Alexandrine artistry attest that it later became the centre of Western influence in the Gandhara region. It seems probable that Taxila had been the capital of the Achaemenian satrapy of India, just as first Paskapuros, Peshawar, and subsequently Pusilautis, Chausadar, had been the chief city of the satrapy of Gandhara or Pakhtunkhwa. The fact that Alexander so readily obtained the submission of the ruler of Taxila, Quintus Curtius gives us his proper name as Omphis, demonstrates that, as the successor of Darius Codomanus, he was held to be entitled to the loyalty of the Achaemenian Indian satrapy. It was not until he reached the Jhelum River, where he overstepped the eastern boundary of the Persian Empire, that he met with determined resistance from Porus, ruler of the Punjab proper. Alexander was not the first or the last to be made to realize that the real limit of the Iranian region is not the Khyber Pass or even the River Indus, but a point near ancient Taxila where the modern road and railway run through the Katgala Pass. Pathans still recognize when they pass it that they are leaving or coming home. Pusilautis and Taxila are the only two places in Arrian's account which can easily be fixed upon a modern map. It has been normal practice to assert that Hephaestion's route from Nicaea in Ningrahar into the Peshawar plain was through the Khyber Pass, but there is nothing in the texts to establish this assumption in any absolute manner. All that we know is that Alexander's flank guard under this general marched from a place somewhere near Jalalabad to Chausadar. We have no place names to connect with Peshawar. If Peshawar had been mentioned, it would be possible to fix with some certainty on the Khyber route as that taken by Hephaestion, but no such reference exists. It is also a matter of some doubt whether in Alexander's time, with unbridged rivers, the Khyber route would have been the easiest, or even the most direct between the places named. Hephaestion may well have crossed the Kabul River in the neighbourhood of Kama or Lalpura, above or below its junction with the Kunar, and before it enters the gorges north of the Khyber. He would then have come down into the Peshawar plain by the Karapa and Gandhab route through what is now Momand country, and entered the Doaba close to Shabkadar. Or he may have followed the river as closely as possible, either on the north bank where the Taraksai Momands now dwell, or on the south bank through the Shilman valleys at the back of the Tatara Peak. Before the Khyber road was built, much traffic followed one or other of these routes, and it is wrong to suppose that the Khyber is the only passage from the west into the Peshawar plain. It remains to consider Alexander's own route. I give here a translation of the relevant portions of Arrian's text. Alexander took command in person of the other division of the army and advanced into the country of the Aspasi, Gurai, and Assassini. The route which he followed was hilly and rugged, and lay along the course of a river called the Chus, which he had difficulty in crossing. Later, he advanced to the river Euaspla, where the chief of the Aspasii was. After operations, he then crossed the mountains and came to a city at their base named Arigaion, where he found the inhabitants had burned the place and taken to flight. As this city seemed to occupy a very advantageous site, he commanded Craterus to fortify it strongly. After further battles in which he defeated the Aspasii, he marched thence to invade the country of the Assassini. Craterus, who had now finished the work of fortifying Arigaion, rejoining him with the hoplites and siege engines, passed through the country of the Gurai, where he had to cross the Guraeus, the river giving the name to that country. Alexander then marched first to attack Massaga, which was the greatest city in those parts. A long description of the siege follows, after which Alexander took the city by storm and captured the mother and daughter of Assasinus. He then dispatched Caunus to Basira, convinced that the inhabitants would capitulate on learning that Massaga had fallen. He also sent Attalus, Alcetas, and Demetrius to another city, Aura, instructing them to draw a rampart round it and to invest it against his own arrival. As regards Caunus, matters did not go well for him at Basira, for, as it stood on a very lofty eminence and was strongly fortified in every quarter, the people trusted to the strength of their position and made no proposals for surrender. Alexander directed his march first to Aura, which he captured at the first assault. When the inhabitants of Basira heard that Aura had fallen, they regarded their case as desperate and at dead of night fled from their city to the rock in that land named Aornos. Alexander, seized with an ardent desire to capture this mountain also, made Aura and Massaga strongholds for bridling the districts around them, and at the same time strengthened the defences of Basira. Meanwhile, the division under Hephaestion had marched on to the Indus, where they began preparing a bridge to span it in accordance with Alexander's orders. Alexander then first marched towards that river and received the submission of Puteoli, and then occupied himself in reducing other small towns situated near the Indus. He then marched to the Rock of Aornos. If it were not for a passage in Strabo, 15,697, we should be in doubt how the route taken by Alexander lay with reference to that of Hephaestion. From Arrian's account as it stands, it would be equally possible to select a route for the conqueror over the Sufid Ko and down into Kohat, for that is even more hilly and rugged than the routes to the north. But Strabo makes it clear for us that Alexander took the northern route on hearing that it was more fertile, while that to the south was either waterless or liable to flood, and thinking that the rivers would be easier to cross towards their sources. Given this certainty, and given also the whole trend of the account, which shows that he did not descend into the Peshawar plain until after reducing the hill fortresses of Arigaion, Massaga, Basira, and Aura, a knowledge of topography makes his general route clear enough. The rivers he crossed were the Chouis, Euaspla, and Guraeus in that order. Between the Euaspla and the Guraeus was a mountain divide. This can only have been the Kunar watershed where the Duran line now runs, and the Chouis would then be the Alishang and the Euaspla the Kunar. The Guraeus is the Panchkora, which appears as the Gauri in the Sanskrit of the 6th book of the Mahabharata. Arigaion would then be Nawagai in Bajaur, which is in fact situated in a very advantageous site, commanding the Bajaur valleys. After crossing the Panchkora, Alexander would necessarily take the route through Talash in order to avoid the lower Panchkora and Swat gorges, and so cross the Katgala Pass into Adinzai and arrive on the banks of the Swat River at Chakdara. There is nothing to show by which route he left Swat to reach the Peshawar plain, and we have still to determine the location of Massaga, Basira, and Aura. This, and the fixing of the site of Aornos, is the theme of some fascinating explorations undertaken in 1926 by Aurel Stein. The stir and the thrill comes, I think, from a sudden discovery that, while no local record or memory remains of those far-off events, it is still possible from the tactical accounts rendered by Arrian and the others to recognise on the ground today some of the actual strongholds which fell to the arms of the Macedonian. In so doing, we can see again the heavy-armed hoplites of Alexander's phalanx and almost hear the headlong rush of his cavalry carrying his standard up the broad and beautiful valley of Swat. Stein makes no attempt to locate Massaga, saying only it should be somewhere in Lower Swat, which he did not fully investigate. We know from Arrian's account that it was east of the Panchkora, the Guraeus, but he gives no clear topographical detail in this case whereby a certain recognition can be made. an obvious tactical centre in this region, held by the British and by the Mughals before them, is Chakdara, the point where the present-day roads to Dir and Upper Swat diverge and on the bank of the Swat River. But had Massaga been at this point, it is certain that Arrian would have mentioned its location on the bank of a great smoothly running river. Such topographical details as we have of Massaga are to be found in Curtius, who calls it Massaga, and describes the site as barred on the east by an impetuous mountain stream with steep banks on both sides, while to the south and west nature, as if designing to form a rampart, had piled up gigantic rocks, at the base of which lay sloughs and yawning chasms. This description answers very closely to the topography of the Katgala Pass between the valleys of Talash and Adinzai, about 8 miles north of Chakdara on the present road to Dir. Here, just below the pass, is a circumvallation of hills and a stream, the Vuchkwa, corresponding to Curtius' description and forming a natural moat on the east. There are also many deep ravines and piles of ruins of ancient buildings marked Buddhist ruins on the map. As in most striking spots in these regions, there is also here the ziyarat, or shrine, of a Muslim saint named Mujawar Baba, surrounded by a clump of large trees. The place is admirably sited to bar the only west-east road practicable for armies through these hills, and to command the rich surrounding cornlands of Talash and Adinzai. There is no doubt that both Alexander and Babur, 18 centuries later, came this way. Like Shahsada, these ruins have never been subjected to systematic digging, but there is every hope that they would yield a rich harvest. There is a further feature on the ground which helps to identify the Katgala site with Massaga. While, as I have said, Arrian's account of this siege lacks topographical detail, he mentions a little hill at some distance from the camp, onto which Alexander withdrew his men as a feint. An isolated small hill, as the sketch shows, is to be seen on the ground east of the pass and close to the road. It fits the description. Before leaving Massaga, I must record 2 details which bring the whole scene to life. Alexander, while superintending the erection of a mole to fill one of the ravines, was wounded by an arrow in the leg. Arrian says in the ankle, Curtius in the calf. When the barb was extracted, he called for his horse and, without so much as having his wound bandaged, continued with energy unabated to prosecute the work on hand. But when the injured limb was hanging without support, and the gradual cooling, as the blood dried, aggravated the pain, he is reported to have said that though he was called, as all knew, the son of Jupiter, this wound proclaimed him to be a man. And then, smiling magnificently, Alexander looked up to his surgeons on the Katgala Pass and quoted Homer, "This, my friends, is blood. It is not the ichor which the blessed immortals shed." The other incident is best told in Curtius' own words. The people of Massaga, giving up the defence as hopeless, withdrew into the citadel whence, as nothing but surrender was open, they sent down envoys to Alexander,